In the spring of 1607, 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery sailed into the muddy waters of the James River. Aboard were about 100 English settlers, men driven by dreams of gold, glory, and new beginnings. They believed they were bringing civilization to an untamed wilderness. But as the ships unloaded and the settlers built crude wooden huts along the riverbank, one truth became painfully clear. Their survival in this strange land would not be decided by royal charters or shining treasure. It would be decided by something far more basic, far more urgent: food. And so the question loomed over Jamestown from its very first day. What would they eat to stay alive? When we remember Jamestown, we often recall the big names and dramatic stories: Captain John Smith, Pocahontas, or the great struggle between settlers and the Powhatan Confederacy. But rarely do we ask about the most ordinary and yet most vital part of life: the meals. What filled the bowls and bellies of those settlers? What foods were discovered in the forests and rivers of Virginia? What was shared and what was fought over at the table of Jamestown? The truth is, the story of Jamestown is written as much in kitchens and cookpots as it is in council halls and battlefields. To understand how the first permanent English colony in America survived, we must look at the foods that sustained them, or at times failed to sustain them. Close your eyes for a moment and picture yourself among the settlers. You've just stepped off a small, crowded ship after 4 long months at sea. The smell of salt and tar lingers on your clothes. Your stomach churns not only from seasickness, but from hunger. The supplies you've brought from England are familiar, but dwindling. Barrels of salted beef and pork. Hardtack biscuits so tough they can crack a tooth. Dried peas, butter, cheese, oatmeal, and beer, all staples of an English diet at sea. For now, these are your meals. They remind you of home, even if they taste stale and monotonous. But soon, you realize the problem. Those barrels will not last forever. Already, the Virginia heat spoils the meat faster than you expected. Insects creep into the grain sacks. Water from the James River tastes brackish, mixed with salt and swamp. Within weeks, survival will depend on learning how to eat from this new land. Jamestown was not an easy place to live. The swampy ground bred disease. Mosquitoes carried fevers. The summer sun scorched crops, while winter brought freezing winds. To the settlers, accustomed to the rolling fields of England, this wilderness was hostile and alien. And then there was hunger, always hunger. Food was never guaranteed. In fact, hunger became Jamestown's most constant companion, a shadow following the colonists through every season. During the worst times, settlers starved. Out of the 500 colonists who lived in Jamestown in the winter of 1609, only 60 survived by spring. That dreadful season would be remembered as the starving time. Yet food was not only about desperation, it was also about discovery, adaptation, and cultural exchange. The settlers encountered new crops, maize, beans, squash, foods that seemed coarse at first, but soon became lifelines. They fished the rivers for sturgeon and catfish. They hunted deer, turkeys, and rabbits in the forests. They gathered berries, nuts, and grapes from the wild, and at times they received gifts or hard bargains from the Powhatan people, who had mastered the art of living from the land for centuries. One of the most fascinating aspects of Jamestown's story is how food connected to very different worlds. The Powhatan people saw corn as life itself. They roasted it on the cob, ground it into flour, or boiled it into a dish called hominy. They made stews with beans and squash, sweetened with fruits, or flavored with venison. They taught the settlers how to plant in Virginia's soil, when to hunt certain animals, and how to preserve food for the winter. To the English, at first, these foods were strange, even unappealing. They missed the taste of wheat bread, ale, and roasted beef. But hunger is a great teacher. Slowly, the settlers learned that without powhatan corn, there could be no Jamestown. Yet, food also became a weapon. When relations between settlers and natives broke down, trade ended. The Powhatan knew that by withholding corn, they could starve the colony. And so, every grain of corn became not just nourishment, but diplomacy, leverage, and survival. Over the course of this series, we will step inside the kitchens of Jamestown. We will explore the 25 foods that sustained the first English settlement in America. Some will sound familiar: venison stew, roasted turkey, cornbread, oysters from the Chesapeake Bay. Others may surprise you: sturgeon so large they seemed endless, ash cakes baked in hot coals, or maple sugar used as a sweetener. Still, others will shock you: foods eaten only out of desperation when the colony faced starvation. Each of these foods carries a story of where it came from, how it was prepared, and what it meant to the people eating it. Together, they paint a picture of life in Jamestown that is vivid, raw, and human. Jamestown was more than a struggling outpost. It was the beginning of a new nation. And the foods eaten there would shape American cuisine for centuries to come. The cornmeal porridge of the Powhatan, the salted pork of the English Navy, the smoked fish of Virginia's Riversole. These elements blended to form the earliest version of what we now call American food. Food was not just survival, it was tradition, adaptation, and identity. By looking at the meals of Jamestown, we see not only what people ate, but how cultures collided, clashed, and combined to give birth to something entirely new. So, as we begin this journey into the kitchens and cookfires of the 1600s, remember this: Jamestown was not built on gold or power. It was built on food. The meals shared, the foods discovered, the desperate measures taken to stave off hunger. These were the true foundations of America's first colony. And perhaps, by examining what the settlers ate, we can answer a bigger question: how did a fragile, starving colony on the edge of collapse become the birthplace of the United States? Join me as we step back into the year 1607 and sit down at the table of Jamestown. The menu may surprise you. When the settlers of Jamestown first arrived in 1607, they did not step off their ships into an empty wilderness. They brought with them barrels, crates, and sacks filled with food from England. These supplies had sustained them during the long Atlantic crossing, and they would be expected to keep the colony alive until crops could be planted or trade with the natives established. The list of provisions looks familiar to any English household of the time: salted pork and beef packed tightly into barrels, dried fish smoked to last months at sea, hardtack biscuits made from flour, water, and salt rock hard, nearly indestructible and barely edible, dried peas, beans, and lentils to boil into soups, cheese, butter, and oatmeal, comforting staples that reminded the settlers of home, and, of course, beer. In the 1600s, beer was considered safer to drink than water, and so it was rationed carefully, a taste of familiarity in a strange new world. For the first days, the settlers ate as if they were still in England. They boiled peas into thick stews, softened hardtack by dipping it in broth, and sliced cheese to share around the campfires. But this illusion of normalcy did not last. The Virginia climate quickly revealed itself to be an enemy of English provisions. The humid summer heat spoiled salted meat, insects crept into sacks of grain, barrels leaked or grew mold. Even the hardtack, so famously durable, softened and rotted when exposed to the damp air of the James River swamps. What had been carefully packed for survival now became a race against decay. Every day, more food was lost. The settlers had no choice but to ration tightly, eating less with each passing week. And as supplies shrank, tempers grew. Jamestown's men were already divided, gentlemen unused to work, soldiers eager for conflict, craftsmen with little experience in farming. Hunger turned quarrels into open arguments. The settlers had imagined Virginia as a land of plenty, overflowing with resources. But they quickly discovered how unprepared they were for the reality. Few of the colonists were farmers. The Virginia soil, fertile but different from the fields of England, confused them. Crops planted too late or in the wrong places failed. Wells dug near the river filled with brackish, undrinkable water. Even hunting, which seemed at first a solution, proved harder than expected. The forests were dense and unfamiliar, the animals swift and difficult to catch. Many of the settlers were not skilled hunters at all. They had expected gold, not deer, fortunes, not fish. And so, as the weeks turned into months, hunger began to gnaw more deeply. By late summer, sickness spread through the camp. The combination of spoiled food, polluted water, and lack of fresh provisions left the settlers weak. Diaries and letters from Jamestown tell of a sickness that swelled men's bodies with water, that made their skin yellow and brought death within days. Some of these illnesses were likely scurvy, caused by the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. Others were dysentery, spread by drinking from the contaminated river. Whatever the cause, the outcome was grim. Dozens died within the first months, their bodies buried quickly outside the wooden palisade. The survivors grew desperate. They scoured the forests for berries and nuts, but these were seasonal and unreliable. They tried fishing in the James River, and though sometimes they caught sturgeon, at other times they returned empty-handed. Hunger became the settlers' daily companion, stalking them from morning to night. Captain John Smith, who would soon rise as one of Jamestown's most important leaders, recognized that hunger could destroy the colony faster than any enemy. He introduced strict rules about food. Rations were divided equally, hoarding was punished, and everyone was expected to work for their share. Still, there was never enough. Rations shrank to small handfuls of grain, thin soups with little meat, and crusts of stale bread. Beer, once a comfort, was soon gone. The colonists drank from the muddy river, which only sickened them further. Letters sent back to England spoke of extreme want and begged for fresh supplies. The settlers waited anxiously for ships to arrive, carrying more barrels of food from across the sea. But the Atlantic crossing was long and uncertain. For months at a time, Jamestown stood on the edge of starvation. It was in these early struggles that the settlers first turned to the Powhatan people. The Powhatan tribes had lived in Virginia for generations. They knew the land, the seasons, and the foods it could provide. At times, they traded corn, beans, and venison with the English. These trades were not simply about food, they were about politics. Each exchange reinforced a fragile relationship, sometimes friendly, sometimes tense. For the settlers, Powhatan corn was unlike anything they had eaten before. It was coarse compared to English wheat, but it filled their bellies. Slowly, they began to understand that without the help of the Powhatan, Jamestown might not last a single year. Yet this reliance also bred resentment and fear. The English wanted independence, not dependence. They longed for the foods of home, for wheat, bread, and beef, for ale and butter. Instead, they chewed roasted corn and venison jerky, grateful but unsatisfied. When relations with the Powhatan broke down, as they often did, trade ended. Suddenly, the settlers faced starvation again. the fragile lifeline could be cut at any moment, and the English knew it. This tension between hope and hunger, between survival and pride would define the first years of Jamestown. By the end of the first year, the colony was already in crisis. Of the 104 settlers who had landed, barely half were alive. Graves lined the edge of the camp. Food was scarce, and hope was fragile. But Jamestown did not collapse. The settlers endured, clinging to life with whatever food they could find, whether from spoiled rations, the forests and rivers, or the generosity of their Powhatan neighbors. This was the reality of Jamestown's early struggles. Survival was never guaranteed, and every meal was uncertain. The early years of Jamestown were not golden dreams, they were a daily fight against hunger. The settlers arrived with English food, but quickly discovered that it would not be enough. Spoilage, sickness, and scarcity turned every day into a gamble. Food was not just sustenance. It was the dividing line between life and death, between hope and despair. And so, as Jamestown stumbled into its second year, the question remained: how would the settlers adapt? What new foods would they discover in this strange land? And could they truly survive on the foods of Virginia? In the next part of our story, we will step into the kitchens of the Powhatan people, whose knowledge of corn, beans, and squash would prove to be the difference between life and death for Jamestown. Long before the English arrived, the Powhatan people thrived along the rivers and forests of Virginia. They were not merely surviving in the land was part of them. Every season, every plant, every animal had its role in the Powhatan diet. They knew when the fish would swim upstream, when the deer would fatten in the forests, when the nuts would fall from the trees. To the English, Virginia seemed wild and unpredictable. To the Powhatan, it was a well-stocked pantry. Their table was rich, diverse, and carefully balanced, shaped by generations of knowledge. And it was this knowledge, this intimate relationship with the land, that the Jamestown settlers desperately needed. The single most important food the Powhatan offered was corn or maize. To the English, corn was strange at first. They were used to wheat bread, finely ground flour baked into loaves. Cornmeal, by comparison, seemed coarse, gritty, and unfamiliar. But hunger changed their perspective. The Powhatan showed them how corn could be eaten in many forms. Roasted on the cob, simple and filling. Ground into meal for baking ash cakes. Small breads cooked directly in hot ashes. Boiled into hominy, a hearty dish that could be flavored with beans or meat. Made into gruel or porridge, easy to cook and digest. For the Powhatan, corn was not just food, it was life itself. Fields of maize lined their villages, tended by women who were the primary farmers. The crop provided steady nourishment throughout the year, and surplus corn could be stored for the winter. For the English settlers, corn became salvation. Without it, Jamestown may not have survived its first decade. Alongside corn, the Powhatan grew to other vital crops: beans and squash. Together, these three plants were known among many native peoples as the Three Sisters. Beans climbed up the cornstalks, enriching the soil with nutrients and providing protein. Squash and pumpkins spread across the ground, their broad leaves shading the earth, keeping it moist and preventing weeds. Corn, tall and sturdy, offered structure and starch. The genius of this system was that each plant supported the others, creating a sustainable and efficient method of farming. The result was a balanced diet that gave the Powhatan strength and resilience. To the English, this was a revelation. They had come expecting to sow wheat and barley, but those crops failed in Virginia's soil. Instead, they found themselves learning the wisdom of the Three Sisters. Foods that would one day form the backbone of American agriculture. Beyond the fields, The Powhatan hunted the forests for deer, rabbits, and turkeys. Venison was a staple of their diet, roasted over open fires or stewed with vegetables. Deer hides were used for clothing and trade, but the meat was prized above all. Turkeys, plentiful in the forests, were roasted whole or smoked for preservation. Smaller animals, squirrels, raccoons, rabbits were trapped and added to stews. Nothing went to waste. For the settlers, who often struggled to hunt effectively, Powhatan venison was both exotic and precious. It was a taste of strength, a reminder of the abundance hidden in Virginia's wilderness. The rivers and bays of Virginia were alive with fish. The Powhatan fished for sturgeon, catfish, shad, and eels, using nets, traps, and spears. In the summer, massive sturgeon swam the James River, some so large they seemed almost mythical. Along the coast, oysters, clams, and crabs were gathered in great quantities. These shellfish could be eaten fresh, smoked, or dried for later use. To the Powhatan, the river was a dependable food source, one that required skill but offered plenty. The English learned from these practices. At times, sturgeon was one of the only things keeping Jamestown alive. Even Captain John Smith wrote of sturgeon as our best sustenance. The Powhatan also foraged for wild foods to enrich their diets. Berries, strawberries, raspberries, and blackberries were gathered in summer. Grapes grew wild in Virginia, sweet and plentiful. In the fall, nuts such as acorns, walnuts, and chestnuts were collected and stored. Some were ground into meal, others roasted or boiled. Roots and tubers provided additional sustenance, while herbs and plants were used for both food and medicine. These foraged foods added variety and nutrition to the Powhatan table. For the settlers, who often suffered from a lack of fresh vegetables, they were life-saving. The Powhatan prepared their food with remarkable skill. Meats were roasted, smoked, or stewed in clay pots. Corn was ground with stone mortar, baked into ash cakes, or boiled into thick soups. Foods were often flavored with berries, nuts, or herbs. Cooking fires were central to Powhatan villages, and meals were communal events. Women prepared most of the food, passing knowledge from mother to daughter. This culinary tradition was not only about nourishment, it was about community, culture, and continuity. For the English, who were used to bread ovens and iron pots, Powhatan cooking seemed simple. Yet it was perfectly adapted to the land. Over time, the settlers adopted many of these techniques. Blending them with their own food was more than sustenance, it was power. When the Powhatan traded corn with the settlers, it was not charity. It was a political act, a way of controlling relations. Corn could be given as a gift to secure peace, or withheld to punish aggression. At times, Chief Powhatan and his people supplied Jamestown with the grain they desperately needed. At other times, when war broke out, they refused, leaving the settlers to starve. Food was the weapon the Powhatan wielded most effectively. The settlers knew it. Every bushel of corn they received carried a reminder. Survival in Virginia was not something they could achieve alone. For the settlers, eating Powhatan food was both salvation and humiliation. They longed for the familiar tastes of home: bread, beef, beer, butter. Instead, they chewed roasted corn and venison jerky, drank from the river, and learned to appreciate squash and beans. Some embraced these new foods, recognizing their value. Others resisted, seeing them as inferior. Yet hunger has a way of changing minds. Over time, Jamestown's table became less English and more Powhatan, and in that blending, a new American cuisine began to emerge. The Powhatan's table was not only rich in food, it was rich in wisdom. Corn, beans, squash, venison, fish, berries, and nuts formed a diet that had sustained the Powhatan for generations. For the settlers of Jamestown, these foods were the difference between life and death. They were the bridge between old world and new, between starvation and survival. But this bridge was fragile. Trade depended on peace, and peace was never certain. When relations broke down, the settlers faced the full force of hunger once again. In the next chapter, we will leave the villages of the Powhatan and follow the settlers as they turn to the forests and rivers themselves. There, in the wild, they will hunt, fish, and gather, learning, often painfully, to feed themselves in Virginia's unforgiving land. After months of relying on Powhatan corn and kindness, the settlers at Jamestown faced a hard truth. They could not always depend on native trade. Peace was fragile. Conflict simmered. At any moment, Chief Powhatan could close his stores of maize and leave the English to starve. So the colonists turned their eyes to the wilderness around them. Surely the rivers and forests of Virginia, so lush, so teeming with life, would provide enough food to sustain them. But knowing food is there and knowing how to get it are two very different things. The Powhatan had centuries of experience, inherited skills, and spiritual connections with the land. The English, they had muskets that often misfired, clumsy traps, and little patience for the slow art of living off nature. Still, survival demanded that they try. The forests of Virginia were alive with game. Deer, wild turkeys, rabbits, and even bears roamed the woods. Squirrels darted between branches, while raccoons and opossums scavenged at night. To English eyes, it seemed like an endless banquet waiting to be taken. But hunting proved harder than they imagined. Muskets of the early 1600s were unreliable. They were slow to load, inaccurate, and often scared away more animals than they killed. Traps had to be carefully placed, and snares required skill the settlers rarely possessed. Even when they managed to kill a deer, transporting it back to Jamestown was exhausting work. And because refrigeration did not exist, meat spoiled quickly in Virginia's humid heat. Some settlers did learn from the Powhatan, who hunted with bows, arrows, and deep knowledge of animal behavior. They watched how native hunters moved silently through the forest, reading tracks and knowing the habits of each creature. Slowly, a few Englishmen began to adapt, but most still struggled to provide enough meat. Among the wild game, none fascinated the settlers more than the wild turkey. Large, plentiful, and surprisingly bold, turkeys became a frequent prize when muskets managed to hit their mark. Turkeys were roasted over open fires, their meat juicy and filling. Sometimes they were smoked to last longer. The English marveled at these birds, so different from the chickens back home, yet destined to become a symbol of American abundance. But turkeys alone could not sustain Jamestown. Hunting was unpredictable. For every successful catch, there were long days of failure. If the forests tested their patience, the rivers and bays tested their skills. Virginia's waters were rich with sturgeon, catfish, shad, eels, and crabs. The James River in particular was famous for its massive sturgeon, some weighing hundreds of pounds. Captain John Smith himself wrote that sturgeon was often the colony's best food source. But fishing was not as simple as throwing in a line. The settlers had little knowledge of the local waters. Their nets often tore, their hooks bent, and their boats were poorly suited to the rivers. When they succeeded, the reward was great. Sturgeon provided thick, meaty flesh, while smaller fish could be roasted or dried. Crabs and oysters were gathered along the shoreline, sometimes in such abundance that even the hungriest settler was satisfied. Yet, fishing, like hunting, could not always be counted on. Seasons changed. Storms disrupted the waters. And when hunger grew desperate, Patience for fishing grew thin. Foraging offered another chance at survival. The settlers quickly discovered that Virginia's forests and fields provided wild foods if one knew where to look. They gathered berries in summer, such as strawberries, raspberries, and blackberries. Grapevines curled through the woods, offering sweet clusters. In autumn, acorns, walnuts, and chestnuts fell in abundance, though acorns required soaking or boiling to remove their bitterness. Roots and tubers could be dug from the soil. Wild onions, herbs, and edible greens appeared in spring. Mushrooms tempted some, though with danger, for without proper knowledge, poison could lurk in a careless bite. The Powhatan were masters of this knowledge. The settlers, less so. Some tried to eat unripe berries or unknown plants, and sickness followed. Foraging became a lesson in trial and error, sometimes with deadly results. Despite all these efforts, hunting, fishing, and gathering, the settlers never gathered enough food to feel secure. Supplies were inconsistent. Successes were celebrated, but failures were more common. In desperation, some turned to eating their horses, dogs, cats, and even rats. When wild food could not be found, the forests seemed full, but for men without skill, they were nearly empty. This harsh reality revealed the truth. Jamestown's survival depended not only on the land, but on the knowledge to live with it. And much of that knowledge belonged to the Powhatan. Over time, necessity forced the English to adopt Powhatan methods. They copied their fishing weirstone traps built in rivers to catch fish. They experimented with planting corn, beans, and squash, as the Powhatan had taught them. They learned to dry and smoke meat for preservation. These lessons were not always embraced willingly. Pride and prejudice often kept the English from admitting how much they relied on native wisdom. But without it, Jamestown would have starved far sooner. As the years passed, hunting, fishing, and gathering became less a desperate act of survival and more a supplement to farming and trade. Still, in those early days, the wilderness was both friend and foe. It offered life, but demanded respect. For the settlers, the forests and rivers of Virginia were classrooms. Each mistake was costly, each success a triumph. Slowly, painfully, they began to learn how to survive, not as Englishmen in Virginia but as new Americans shaped by Virginia itself. Hunting, fishing, and gathering had provided the Powhatan with abundance. For the settlers, it provided lessons written in hunger and hardship. The rivers gave fish, the forests gave game, and the fields gave wild fruits. But never enough, never certain. Jamestown survived, but barely, and so the settlers turned again to what they knew best. Farming. If they could master the soil of Virginia, perhaps they could grow not just enough to eat, but enough to thrive. By the time the settlers had exhausted their luck with hunting and fishing, one truth had become undeniable. Jamestown could not survive on chance alone. The rivers might run dry of sturgeon, the forests might be empty of deer, but the soil, if treated with care, would always yield food. And so, farming became not just a task, but the colony's lifeline. But what would they grow? The settlers had arrived with dreams of gold, not plows. Their knowledge of agriculture was limited to English grains like wheat, barley, and rye crops poorly suited to Virginia's humid climate and sandy soil. The key to their survival would come not from England, but from the people they had first dismissed. The Powhatan introduced the settlers to maize corn, a crop unlike any they had seen before. Tall, sturdy, and perfectly adapted to Virginia's climate, corn quickly became the backbone of survival. The English learned how to plant kernels in small mounds, how to space them properly, and how to harvest ears before rot set in. They learned to grind corn into meal for porridge or ash cakes, and to roast the ears over open flames. Corn could be eaten fresh in summer, dried and stored through winter, and even traded. It was reliable in a way hunting and foraging had never been. In fact, without Powhatan corn, Jamestown would almost certainly have perished in its first decade. But corn was not alone. The Powhatan practiced what is now known as the Three Sisters planting method: corn, beans, and squash grown together in harmony. The beans climbed the tall corn stalks, fixing nitrogen in the soil and enriching it. The squash spread across the ground, its broad leaves shading the soil and keeping weeds at bay. Together, these three crops created a balanced diet and a sustainable farming system. The English, at first skeptical, eventually adopted this practice. It was one of the earliest examples of them setting aside their pride and learning from native wisdom. Even as they relied on native crops, the settlers clung to their old world traditions. They attempted to grow wheat and barley, though yields were poor. They planted gardens with peas, carrots, turnips, lettuce, and cabbages, often using seeds brought from England. Some of these vegetables thrived in Virginia's soil, providing much-needed variety. Others failed, leaving the settlers frustrated and hungry. Still, the attempt revealed a crucial shift. Jamestown was becoming an agricultural colony, not a treasure-hunting outpost. If corn kept Jamestown alive, tobacco made it rich. In 1612, John Rolfe began experimenting with planting Nicotiana tabacum, a sweeter variety of tobacco imported from the Caribbean. Unlike the harsher native tobacco, Rolfe's crop appealed to the tastes of European markets. The results were revolutionary. Tobacco thrived in Virginia's soil, and soon it became the colony's first true cash crop. Fields that once grew food, now filled with rows of tobacco. Colonists who once dreamed of gold, now dreamed of green leaves drying in barns, ready to be shipped across the Atlantic. But there was a cost. As tobacco spread, food crops were neglected. Hunger still haunted Jamestown, even as its ships overflowed with profits. Farming in Jamestown was no easy task. The settlers lacked plows suited for the soil, and much of the work was done with simple hoes, shovels, and bare hands. Clearing the thick forests of Virginia demanded brutal labor, with trees felled and stumps burned out to make way for fields. At first, farming fell on the shoulders of unwilling settlers, gentlemen unused to labor, soldiers trained for war, and adventurers seeking riches. Many resisted, leading to poor harvests and constant shortages. To enforce discipline, leaders like John Smith declared a new law: "He who does not work shall not eat." This rule forced even the proudest Englishman into the fields, lest he starve. Later, as tobacco profits soared, the labor problem found its grim solution: the importation of indentured servants from England and eventually the enslavement of Africans, marking the beginning of a dark chapter in American history. Farming was only half the battle. Once crops were grown, they had to be preserved. Without refrigeration, settlers used methods taught by both English tradition and Powhatan practice. Corn was dried and stored in wooden barrels. Beans were strung and hung, and squash was cured for winter. Meat from hunting was smoked, while fish could be salted. Still, spoilage was common, and poor storage often led to rot, mold, or infestation. Every successful harvest was celebrated, but every loss carried the shadow of hunger. As years passed, farming was no longer just survival, it became Jamestown's identity. The colony that began as a gamble for gold had become an agricultural settlement. Corn and beans filled their bellies. Tobacco filled their coffers. Gardens of English vegetables connected them to home. Farming shaped not only their diet, but their culture, their economy, and their relationship with the land. Jamestown was no longer just a desperate camp of hungry men. It was becoming the foundation of an agricultural society that would one day spread across an entire continent. From the shaky hands of starving men came the steady rhythm of farming. From the gift of corn came survival. From the gamble of tobacco came wealth. Farming turned Jamestown from a fragile outpost into the seed of a nation. Yet this seed was planted not only in soil, but in struggle, fed by native knowledge, watered by hardship, and harvested with sweat. By the time Jamestown settlers had learned how to plant, hunt, and gather, one question still lingered. What did their meals actually look like? It is one thing to grow corn, or hunt a deer, or haul fish from the James River. It is another to turn those raw ingredients into a meal that could feed a colony. And in Jamestown, where firewood was damp, tools were few, and pots were precious, the act of cooking was as much survival as farming or fishing. The meals of Jamestown were shaped by necessity, resourcefulness, and a constant blending of English tradition with Powhatan knowledge. Around smoky hearths, settlers tried to recreate the flavors of home while adapting to the ingredients of a new world. Corn was not just a crop. It was the foundation of the Jamestown diet. For breakfast, colonists often ate a simple cornmeal porridge, a hot, thick dish that resembled English gruel. It could be flavored with milk, if cows were available, sweetened with honey, or even salted with dried fish. At midday, cornmeal might be baked into ashcake dough, pressed into patties, and cooked directly on hot ashes or stones by the fire. These were quick, filling, and easy to carry for field work. For supper, corn might appear again, boiled into hominy corn, treated with lye water, or added to stews with beans and squash. Sometimes, when meat was scarce, colonists simply ate corn mush 3 times a day, week after week. It was not glamorous, but it kept them alive. And for the English, it was a strange new food turned into a daily companion. If one dish defined Jamestown, it was the stew. Into large iron pots went whatever was available: corn, beans, roots, herbs, fish, venison, or even scraps of salted pork from England. Stews simmered slowly over open flames, stretching meager ingredients into a meal that could feed many. A rabbit might flavor a pot of broth for days. A handful of beans might be bulked up with wild greens. For seasoning, settlers used whatever they could. Imported spices like pepper and nutmeg were rare luxuries, but salt when available was essential. Native herbs such as sassafras, mint, or wild onions also found their way into the pot, adding local flavors to English recipes. The result was a cuisine both familiar and foreign. English-style stews infused with American ingredients. One of the greatest disappointments for the colonists was the lack of wheat bread. In England, bread was the cornerstone of every meal. In Jamestown, wheat simply refused to grow well. Instead, settlers relied on cornmeal bread. Sometimes this was baked in crude clay ovens. More often, it was cooked as flat cakes or ash bread, earthy in flavor and dense in texture. Occasionally, small batches of wheat flour arrived on supply ships. But it was hoarded and saved for special occasions, feasts, or visits from important leaders. For everyday life, bread was not the soft English loaf, but the coarse and smoky cake of the New World. When hunting was successful, meat turned an ordinary meal into a feast. Colonists ate venison, rabbit, wild turkey, ducks, geese, and squirrels. Fish, especially sturgeon, catfish, and perch, were boiled, roasted, or smoked. Domesticated animals slowly appeared as well. Pigs, brought from Europe, thrived in Virginia and provided salted pork. Chickens laid eggs. Eventually, cows offered both milk and beef, though cattle were scarce in the early years. But meat was rarely eaten in abundance. It was stretched thin, often chopped into stews or smoked for preservation. A single deer might feed the colony for days, but it was always rationed carefully. The Powhatan not only taught the settlers how to farm, they shaped how they ate. The English adopted Powhatan methods of cooking corn and beans. They learned to make cornbread baked in clay ovens and to use dried fish or venison jerky as flavoring for soups. They also observed how the Powhatan roasted game over open fires or smoked fish to last through the winter. These techniques soon blended with English habits, creating a hybrid cuisine that was neither fully European nor fully native, but something new. Jamestown cooking. Water from the James River was often brackish and unsafe, so settlers looked for alternatives. Beer, the staple drink of England, was difficult to brew in Jamestown due to the scarcity of barley. Some settlers experimented with making beer from corn or wine from wild grapes. Milk became more common as cows multiplied, but in the early years it was rare. Mead-fermented honey was occasionally brewed, and cider from apples would not appear until later plantations began orchards. For most colonists, the daily drink was water, sometimes boiled for safety, sometimes flavored with herbs. It was plain, but it was life. While daily meals were plain and repetitive, feast days brought excitement. When ships arrived from England, bringing flour, sugar, dried fruit, and spices, the colony celebrated. Puddings were made, sweetened breads were baked, and occasionally pies appeared on the table. Christmas, in particular, was marked with as much festivity as circumstances allowed. Roast meats, spiced dishes, and gatherings that reminded settlers of home. These rare occasions offered comfort, a brief return to the flavors of England amidst the hardships of Virginia. Cooking in Jamestown revolved around the hearth, a large open fire that burned day and night. Iron pots hung on chains, spits turned slowly with meat, and flat stones served as makeshift griddles. The kitchen was smoky, hot, and laborious. Cooking was a task that consumed hours each day, gathering firewood, grinding corn, stirring stews, baking ash cakes, and preserving leftovers. It was often women's work, though in the early years, when women were few, men and even children took on the responsibility. In truth, everyone who wanted to eat had to learn to cook. In the end, meals in Jamestown were not just about sustenance. They reflected the rhythm of daily life. Morning began with corn, porridge, or bread. Midday brought stews flavored with whatever the land had provided. Evening ended with more cornmeal, beans, or, if luck was kind, meat. Food told the story of survival. It revealed when the colony was thriving and when it was starving. It showed the blending of English traditions with Powhatan ingenuity. Most of all, it reminded the settlers that though they were far from home, they were slowly building a new one meal at a time. The meals of Jamestown may seem humble by today's standards: corn, mush, stews, smoked fish, ash cakes. Yet within those dishes lay the story of persistence, adaptation, and the first taste of what would become American food. From English porridge to Powhatan hominy, from feast day puddings to everyday stews. Jamestown's table was where cultures collided, hardships endured, and a new way of life took root. Jamestown was not an isolated village, cut off from the world. From the moment the English settlers planted their flag in Virginia, they were tied into an international web of trade, politics, and economics. The colony's survival often depended on the arrival of supply ships from England. On those ships came wheat flour, salted beef, dried peas, hard biscuits, and beer foods that reminded colonists of home. But these shipments were inconsistent, sometimes delayed by storms or captured by rival powers like the Spanish. When ships arrived safely, the mood of the colony lifted. Barrels of flour and salted fish meant relief from endless cornmeal. Imported beer replaced brackish river water. Dried fruit, spices, and sugar gave meals a rare sweetness. But the settlers soon realized that they could not survive on English imports alone. They needed to adapt, and that meant learning from their Powhatan neighbors and building new trade networks that stretched far beyond Virginia. Trade with the Powhatan Confederacy was more than practical, it was political. Powhatan leaders often used food as leverage in negotiations. Corn, beans, venison, and fish became bargaining chips in a delicate balance of peace and conflict. In return, the English offered metal tools, beads, copper, and cloth items, highly valued in Powhatan society. This exchange was never simple. At times, it kept the colony alive. At other times, when relations soured, food was withheld, plunging Jamestown into starvation. Still, these exchanges introduced English colonists to new staples: pumpkins, squash, beans, and corn that would become foundations of the American diet. Without Powhatan contributions, Jamestown might never have survived. Ironically, the food system of Jamestown was not saved by food at all but by tobacco. By the 1610s, colonists discovered that Virginia's soil and climate were perfect for growing tobacco, a crop highly prized in Europe. Suddenly, Jamestown was no longer just a struggling outpost, it became a commercial hub. Tobacco transformed the colony's economy. Instead of farming only for survival, settlers began planting fields of tobacco for export. Ships that once carried food into Jamestown now left with barrels of tobacco bound for England. This prosperity came at a cost. Fields once used for corn or wheat were turned over to tobacco, increasing the colony's dependence on native trade and English imports for food. But tobacco gave Jamestown the wealth it needed to endure, and it tied Virginia into the global market in ways that food alone never could. Jamestown was part of what historians call the Columbian Exchange, the vast transfer of foods, animals, and ideas between the Old World and the New. From Europe came wheat, barley, pigs, cattle, chickens, and grapevines. From the Americas came corn, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, squash, and cacao. In Jamestown, these two food worlds collided. Colonists brought pigs that quickly thrived in Virginia's forests, becoming a staple meat source. They planted fruit tree apples and peaches that slowly transformed the landscape. In return, they adopted corn as their lifeline crop and exported tobacco as their cash crop. The foods of Jamestown were never local alone, they were global, born of an exchange that reshaped diets on both sides of the Atlantic. Another part of this global connection was flavor. Though meals in Jamestown were often plain, when trade allowed, settlers enjoyed spices from halfway across the world. Cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper, and cloves, grown in Asia, sometimes appeared in Virginia kitchens, brought on English ships that traded across oceans. Sugar, harvested in the Caribbean by enslaved labor, was a rare but prized addition, sweetening puddings or drinks. Every spoonful of spiced stew or sweetened porridge connected Jamestown to faraway continents: India, the Caribbean, Africa, through the invisible network of empire. By the early 1600s, Africans were forcibly brought to Virginia. Along with them came food traditions that would quietly shape the colony. African knowledge of rice cultivation, okra, yams, and seasonings slowly filtered into Virginia kitchens. Though the records are sparse, food historians believe that enslaved Africans influenced how corn was cooked, how greens were stewed, and how flavors were built with herbs and spices. Thus, Jamestown was not just an English colony borrowing from Powhatan. neighbors, it was also an early site of African American food culture, a fusion that would grow over centuries into Southern cooking. Despite these connections, Jamestown's relationship with global trade was fragile. Reliance on imports made the colony vulnerable. When ships were delayed, food ran out. When conflicts with the Powhatan flared, trade stopped. When tobacco consumed too much land, hunger returned. This constant tension between local survival and global exchange defined life in Jamestown. Colonists lived with one foot in the forests of Virginia and the other in the markets of London. By the 1620s, Jamestown meals reflected this global fusion. Corn porridge thickened with beans borrowed from Powhatan tradition, salted pork and beef from Europe, fish and venison from Virginia rivers and forests, puddings and pies flavored with Caribbean sugar and Asian spices. Every meal was a mosaic of cultures. It was English, Powhatan, African, European, and American all at once. In this, Jamestown foreshadowed the future of America itself, a land where food would always be a story of migration, exchange, and adaptation. Trade and exchange turned Jamestown from a starving outpost into a permanent settlement. Corn and venison from the Powhatan, pork and beer from England, tobacco for the global market, spices from Asia, and food traditions from Africa flowed through the colony. Jamestown's table was never just local. It was a product of empire, of diplomacy, of survival land, of a new global world being born in the 1600s.